So in 2023, European companies quietly shifted almost 250 billion euros into legally verified green investments.
Yeah, 249 billion to be exact. It's a massive sum of capital.
Unprecedented, really. And, why did they do it? Because the companies spending that money are suddenly just beating everyone else in the stock market.
Right.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are tearing apart a really massive, incredibly timely document. It's the November 2025 Policy Matters report.
From the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative.
Exactly, released right ahead of COP30. And our mission today is to basically cut through all the dense regulatory jargon in this report to show you exactly where trillions of dollars are moving over the next decade.
Because, this isn't just a conversation about the environment anymore.
No, not at all. It is the ultimate shortcut to understanding how the fundamental rules of global business and finance are just being completely rewritten.
It really is a phenomenal stack of sources to analyze. And, what stands out immediately is how the report juxtaposes some incredibly stark, sobering realities with a surprising, almost aggressive amount of financial and regulatory innovation.
Yeah, aggressive is a good word for it.
Right. It provides a true look under the hood of the global economy, and it clearly shows that the people holding the purse strings, they're radically changing their math.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because we have to start with the reality check. The report does not pull its punches on the science, and we need to establish that baseline before we get into the money.
We absolutely do. The report begins with a very blunt admission from the scientific community. 10 years after the Paris Agreement, a 1.5 degree Celsius temperature overshoot is now, it's mathematically inevitable.
Wait, inevitable?
Yes. We are no longer trying to prevent crossing that line. We are definitively going to cross it. The report notes we have already reached the first major tipping point. Global coral reefs are now in terminal decline. And other catastrophic thresholds, like the localized disruption of ocean currents and massive polar ice loss, they're moving from the future risk category into the current reality category.
Okay, I have to push back here because I know exactly what you are thinking as you listen to this. If we've already missed the target, right, and these massive tipping points are already triggering, why does this specific policy report even matter?
That's the logical question, yeah.
Like, why aren't markets just throwing in the towel? If the house is already catching fire, why are we sitting here debating the architectural blueprints?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the goal of global climate policy is no longer about maintaining a pristine, untouched record. The goal now is entirely about limiting the scale and the duration of that overshoot.
Okay.
The difference between peaking at 1.6 degrees and dropping back down versus soaring to 2.5 degrees and staying there, that is a difference between an expensive economic transition and, quite frankly, total global supply chain collapse.
Oh, wow. So every single fraction of a degree directly dictates future economic survival.
Exactly. And global food security.
And the math on getting that temperature back down is pretty brutal, right?
It is. The report details the current NDC's nationally determined contributions.
Those are essentially the official climate pledges countries make to the UN.
Right. Currently, there are 64 updated NECs, and they cover about 30% of global emissions. But when you run the numbers, those pledges only yield a 17% reduction in global greenhouse gases.
17%.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And the science strictly dictates we need a 60% reduction by 2035 just to keep the overshoot manageable and, relatively brief.
So throwing in the towel just isn't an option for central banks or governments.
Not unless they're willing to accept a completely disorderly, catastrophic unwinding of the global economy.
Which perfectly explains why the geopolitics around this are shifting so rapidly. The report makes a very impartial, factual observation here about a massive divergence in global policy.
Yeah, this part is fascinating.
In the United States, we've seen a recent federal policy reversal regarding climate initiatives. At the same time, in the European Union, there has been a period of recalibration, essentially diluting or delaying some of their flagship environmental rules due to internal political pressures.
But the crucial takeaway from the data is that the regulatory momentum hasn't actually stopped.
Right.
It has just shifted geographically. The old narrative was that climate policy was a Western-led global North initiative. That is no longer true.
Exactly. The center of climate policy gravity is moving aggressively to the global South and the Asia-Pacific region.
Yes.
You have countries like Brazil, China, Mexico, and nations across the African Union, specifically Nigeria and Ghana, stepping up and rapidly adopting mandatory corporate sustainability standards.
And they are specifically rallying around something called the ISSB standards?
Right, the International Sustainability Standards Board. It is basically becoming the new global accounting language for climate risk.
Exactly. And the mechanism behind the shift is profound. When the largest emerging markets and manufacturing hubs in the world decide to standardize how companies must report their climate risks,
It creates a regulatory cascade.
it forces multinational corporations everywhere to fall in line, regardless of what their own home country's federal policy happens to be. Capital is global, and the rules governing that capital are now being written in places like São Paulo, Beijing, and Abuja.
Wait, let me make sure I'm mapping this out right. So if a massive Brazilian conglomerate or Chinese manufacturing giant has to legally follow these ISSB rules, they have to audit their entire supply chain to prove their numbers, right?
That's right.
Meaning a mid-sized parts manufacturer in Ohio suddenly has to provide rigorous climate accounting just to keep their international clients,
Exactly.
completely bypassing whatever the local regulations are in Ohio.
That is exactly how it works. It is a domino effect driven by supply chain procurement. If you want to do business globally, you have to speak the global accounting language.
Wow. So capital is global, and the rules are being written in emerging markets. But that forces us to look at what these companies are actually doing versus what they're just saying.
Right, because there's a huge gap there.
Yeah, right now, there's a massive gap between a corporate pledge and a concrete plan. I like to think of a net zero pledge like telling your friends you are going to run a marathon.
Okay, I like this.
It sounds great, you know? Everyone applauds you, you feel wonderful about yourself. But a transition plan, that is showing your friends your daily training schedule, your exact diet breakdown, and the receipt for your highly expensive new running shoes. It is the proof.
I love that analogy, and the UN report focuses heavily on exactly this: transition planning integrity. Because the corporate world right now is utterly saturated with pledges, but severely lacking in receipts.
Yeah, they have the T-shirt, but haven't run a single mile.
Exactly. The report cites Transition Pathway Initiative data showing that out of over 2,000 publicly listed companies analyzed, 81% have public quantitative emissions targets.
81%. That sounds great on paper.
It does. But only a tiny fraction of those companies have actually embedded climate risks into their core business strategy or, committed to fundamentally phasing out their capital expenditure in carbon-intensive assets.
And that concept of assets brings up a crucial distinction in these sources. Carbon lock-in versus stranded assets. People use these interchangeably all the time, but they aren't the same thing, are they?
Not at all.
To me, it seems like stranded assets are an immediate balance sheet risk for the investor today, but carbon lock-in is a systemic risk that guarantees the whole market suffers tomorrow. Am I reading that right?
You've hit the nail on the head. A stranded asset is when an investor suffers a financial loss because a piece of infrastructure loses value prematurely.
Like an early shutdown of a coal plant.
Right. If you finance a coal plant and new clean air regulations force it to shut down 10 years before it pays off its debt, that asset is stranded. The investor takes a massive haircut.
Got it.
Carbon lock-in, on the other hand, is a climate risk that locks in future emissions.
Like building a brand new liquid natural gas terminal today.
Precisely. If you build a new LNG terminal today, that infrastructure requires billions of dollars of investment. To merely pay for itself and generate a return, it mathematically must operate and emit greenhouse gases for the next 30 or 40 years.
Oh, wow. So you are locking the global economy into those future emissions.
What the report emphasizes is that a credible transition plan has to aggressively avoid carbon lock-in. You cannot stand on a stage and promise to be net zero by 2050 while simultaneously deploying capital into new infrastructure that locks in massive emissions until 2065.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the actual money flowing to avoid this lock-in. Capital expenditure or CapEx?
The real money.
Yeah, the real money companies spend to buy, maintain, or improve fixed assets. According to the EU platform on sustainable finance data in the report, in 2023, EU companies' CapEx in taxonomy-aligned sectors, meaning legally verified green projects, not just greenwashed PR, grew by 34%.
That is a massive jump.
Yeah, hitting 249 billion euros. But here is the kicker for anyone listening with an investment portfolio. The companies with higher shares of this legally verified green CapEx are actually outperforming their peers on the financial markets.
And we really need to dig into why they're outperforming. It isn't because the market is suddenly feeling altruistic or, rewarding good moral behavior.
Definitely not.
The financial markets are ruthless. They are rewarding future-proofing.
Because investors are looking down the pipeline at incoming regulations, carbon taxes, and supply chain disruptions.
Exactly. Institutional investors realize that companies spending heavy capex on verified green technology today are actively insulating themselves from massive compliance costs and stranded asset risks tomorrow.
So high green capex has become basically a proxy indicator for forward-thinking, highly competent management.
Exactly. The market is pricing in the reality of the transition and rewarding the companies that are actually building the marathon training schedule, to use your analogy.
Okay, but if the economics of green capex are working so well, and those companies are actively outperforming the laggards, something must be dragging on the brakes. Why aren't we transitioning faster globally?
The report points directly to something it calls corporate policy engagement.
Which is a very polite way of saying lobbying.
Yes, it is the invisible hand on the brake pedal. Lobbying is one of the most critical yet least scrutinized barriers to the transition.
Interesting.
The report pulls data from InfluenceMap, an organization that meticulously tracks how corporations influence climate policy globally. And they highlight a phenomenon known as the lowest common denominator effect.
Wait, I deduced how this works from the notes, and it's wild. Let me see if I have this straight.
Yeah.
A massive corporation can have a shiny, beautiful net zero pledge right on its homepage, right?
Right.
The CEO gives keynote speeches about sustainability.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, they pay massive dues to a trade association. And that trade association takes those dues and actively lobbies lawmakers to kill climate legislation.
Yeah.
So the company keeps its hands clean publicly while secretly funding the opposition.
That is exactly the mechanism. These massive trade associations represent hundreds of companies. But when it comes to lobbying governments on actual legislation, the association often ends up adopting the stance of its most oppositional, recalcitrant members.
The lowest common denominator.
Exactly. So the association fights aggressively against the very Paris Agreement goals that its individual corporate members claim to support on their websites.
This raises an important question. I mean, how is that even legal? It feels like consumer fraud.
It's legal because globally there is a massive accountability and transparency gap.
Okay.
The report confirms that out of the entire G20, only the European Union and India have explicit mandatory disclosure regulations that cover corporate climate policy engagement.
Just the EU and India. Wow.
In the vast majority of the world, companies can legally operate with this two-faced approach because they aren't required to disclose their lobbying footprint.
But the sources also show that the tide is turning on this hypocrisy, largely because of the investors themselves.
Yes. Institutional investors, the pension funds and asset managers actually holding the shares, are getting tired of the systemic risk this lobbying creates.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The report notes that over the last 5 years, thanks to intense shareholder pressure, the proportion of misaligned industry associations has actually dropped from 61% to 38%.
That's a huge drop.
It is. Companies are facing intense pressure to publicly disclose their lobbying activities and, in many cases, to formally leave trade associations that actively sabotage climate goals.
So shareholders are pushing back, but governments are fighting back too, and they are using a very specific, incredibly powerful weapon: prudential frameworks.
Right.
Now, I know that sounds like an incredibly boring bureaucratic accounting term, but it is actually the ultimate enforcer. We were talking about central banks.
Yes, the heavy hitters.
Central banks around the world have quietly stopped treating climate change as an environmental issue and have started treating it as a core financial stability issue.
This is a monumental shift. The core mandate of any central bank is to ensure the economy doesn't collapse. They don't care about the environment, they care about systemic risk.
Right.
And central bankers have run the math. They realized that unmitigated physical climate risks, like worsening superstorms and droughts, combined with a messy, delayed regulatory transition, poses a direct systemic threat to the global banking system.
Because if a major bank has billions of dollars tied up in coastal real estate that becomes uninsurable,
Exactly.
or billions loaned to carbon-heavy industries that suddenly get regulated out of existence, those assets become completely stranded and the bank goes under.
Precisely. So regulators are enforcing prudential frameworks which essentially function as climate stress tests. After the 2008 financial crisis, regulators forced banks to prove they could survive a massive housing market crash.
Right, I remember that.
Today, new regulations in the EU and the UK are literally forcing banks to run scenario analysis. Regulators are looking at banks and saying, show us your loan books and prove you won't go bankrupt if global carbon prices suddenly hit $100 a ton, or if major agricultural zones fail.
And if the bank fails that stress test, what happens?
If the bank has too much capital locked up in those high-risk, high-carbon assets, regulators force them to hold more capital in reserve as a buffer.
And if a bank has to hold more cash in reserve, that makes the loan much more expensive to give out.
Exactly.
It effectively chokes off the capital pipeline to polluting industries at the source, because the interest rates on those loans become economically unviable.
It alters the fundamental cost of capital.
Yeah.
But, the central bank stress tests and corporate transition plans, they're only as good as the data they rely on.
Right.
If the underlying data is flawed, the whole system breaks down, which is why the report places such a heavy emphasis on carbon markets and data integrity.
Right, because for years, the voluntary carbon offset market has been an absolute Wild West.
Oh, completely.
Companies were buying dirt cheap, low-quality offsets, like paying someone not to cut down a tree that was never going to be cut down anyway, just to make their emissions ledgers look balanced. It was pure greenwashing.
It was. But the policy landscape is shifting rapidly to enforce high-integrity carbon credits, specifically under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
Okay, explain the mechanism there. How does Article 6 actually fix the junk offset problem?
Article 6 establishes a rigorous international baseline for what actually counts as a carbon reduction or removal. Crucially, it introduces strict accounting mechanisms like corresponding adjustments.
Corresponding adjustments.
Yes. This means if country A sells a carbon credit to country B, country A has to deduct that carbon reduction from its own ledger.
Oh, I see. So you can't double count the same ton of removed carbon anymore.
Exactly. It forces transparency and actual verifiable atmospheric impact, pushing the junk offsets out of the market.
And while we are mitigating future emissions, the report also highlights the desperate need for resilience finance, or, adaptation. Because, as we discussed at the very beginning, with the 1.5-degree overshoot, severe climate impacts are already baked into the system.
Unfortunately, yes.
Policies now must force companies to build physical and financial resilience against the storms, floods, and supply chain shocks that are coming, regardless of what we do today.
What's fascinating here is, how governments are ultimately enforcing all of this. Because you can have the best central bank stress tests and the best accounting rules in the world, but what happens if a company just ignores the rules or blatantly fakes their transition plan data?
Right.
The final enforcement mechanism isn't just a regulatory fine. It is litigation.
Lawsuits.
Yes. Climate lawsuits are rising globally at an unprecedented rate, and the fundamental nature of these lawsuits is shifting from PR battles to financial crimes.
Because the reporting is becoming mandatory. When a state like California passes its new climate accountability laws, or South Africa updates its corporate governance codes to mandate specific transition plans, it moves climate data from the marketing department to the legal department.
Exactly. In the past, if a company made a vague, glossy promise to be green, it was incredibly difficult to sue them because courts often viewed it as mere marketing puffery.
Right.
But today, because of these incoming laws, emissions disclosures and transition plans are legally mandated financial documents.
Wow. Okay.
When you lie on a legally mandated financial document, it is no longer greenwashing. It is securities fraud. You are misleading your shareholders about material financial risks, and executives can be held personally liable.
So what does this all mean? If you are listening to this right now, whether you are prepping for a board meeting tomorrow morning, trying to figure out where to invest your retirement savings, or just trying to understand the undercurrents of the evening news, here's the bottom line.
Yeah, this is key.
The era of voluntary feel-good green PR is completely dead. We have firmly entered the era of legally binding, financially audited transition plans that are directly linked to executive pay and severe legal liability.
Absolutely.
The blueprints of the global economy are being redrawn, and they are becoming law, driven not just by the West, but by the global South and emerging markets.
It is a profound, irreversible structural shift. The economy is rewiring itself, and capital is flowing to those who are prepared for the reality of the blueprint, rather than those clinging to the glossy brochure.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us to decode the UN's blueprint for the next decade of the global economy. Before we wrap up, my co-host has one final thought for you to chew on.
Yes. Throughout this entire deep dive, we've talked extensively about avoiding carbon lock-in and the financial dangers of stranded assets. But we focused almost entirely on physical infrastructure, like coal plants and financial capital.
Right?
But I want you to consider a completely different type of asset. What about human capital?
Oh, that's interesting.
As these mandatory transition policies rapidly restructure the global economy over the next 10 years, consider the immense risk of stranded skills.
Stranded skill.
If a physical asset, like an auto manufacturing plant, can become obsolete overnight due to new emissions policies, what happens to the massive global workforce that has been trained exclusively for that high-carbon economy?
Wow, yeah. I hadn't even thought of that.
Think about your own community or your own industry. How will educational policy, university degrees, and corporate retraining programs need to aggressively pivot right now to prevent an entire generation of locked-in obsolete labor?
That's a huge question.
It's a massive looming socioeconomic challenge. The transition isn't just about changing what we build, it's about changing what we know how to do. And it is absolutely something you should watch out for as this economic rewiring accelerates.
Stranded skills. That is definitely going to keep me up at night, but it beautifully proves the core point. When the blueprints of the global economy change, absolutely everything inside the house changes with it.
Make sure you are reading the blueprints and not just staring at the brochure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we will catch you next time.